So good morning, welcome back. You're here for Coffee Talk. And if you haven't grabbed the coffee, go out and get one. This is going to be a deeper conversation. So if you weren't here for the first conversation was one on anti-Semitism. And what I did in 30 minutes is I went through the history of anti-Semitism. I went through the details of where anti-Semitism began and how it continued to spread throughout the ages in different places within history from around the world. And what I want to do today is I want to kind of like talk a little bit about anti-Zionism. Is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Is there a relationship there? We've heard about it. You're seeing it take place right now, but I want to kind of double click on it. So anti-Semitism is not just history. It's current events. We're living it right now. And a major problem in today's anti-Zionism is usually an unconscious or veiled form of anti-Semitism. Now, after the Holocaust, after the horrors of the Holocaust, expressing any kind of Jew hatred, which was before the Holocaust acceptable, very acceptable public stance, it was never an issue. But after the Holocaust, expressing anti-Semitism was a form of taboo. Anti-Zionism, therefore, right, they vigorously deny that that they should be categorized as anti-Semites. And many anti-Zionists are not anti-Semites, or at least not consciously anti-Semitic. Often, however, the same age-old anti-Semitism breaks through the anti-Zionist facade. And this is why it's so interesting. And if you wait a little bit, you give me like 10 minutes till I get to like my fourth point in this conversation, you'll see exactly what I mean. There is a famous article written in 1971 by an Israeli columnist named Amos Kenan. And he's quoting, this was actually, I found this in a book called Throwing Jews or Zionists into the Sea. And the name of the head of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, before Yasser Arafat's, his name was Shukeri. And he used to say that the Jews should be driven into the sea. Now, after the 1967 defeat, it became apparent that a slogan of this sort was not very good public relations for the Arab cause. So today, we're not throwing the Jews into the sea, we're throwing only the Zionists are to be thrown into the sea. The trouble is that when the Arabs get through pushing all the Zionists into the sea, there won't be any Jews left in Israel. So you have an issue here. While there's a clear shift in how we use propaganda and talking about Jews in Israel, they said, forget about it. We're not against the Jews. Of course not. We're against the Zionists. The Zionists are the problem. Let's get rid of the Zionists. This is in 1971. Okay, this is not a modern. This was written in 1971. And the statements were made in 1967. Yaakov Malik, who was the Soviet ambassador to the UN in 1971, he says that it's obvious that we substituted the term Zionist for Jews. He says the Zionists have come forward with a theory of the chosen people, an absurd ideology. What do you mean the Zionists did not come forward with the theory of a chosen people? It was the Jews that came forward with that. Why are you calling them Zionists? Because for Mr. Malik, right, that slur disclosed this very deep undercover anti-Semitic sentiment. That it's the Jews that are doing this. You have another quote by Saluk Dasuki. He has a article called "A Zionistic Colony: Jews Are Zionists." Jews, he says, this is a quote, whether they have preserved their religion or whether they have adopted other religions, are known in the U.S. under the collective name Zionist. Another way of saying that all Zionists are Jews. You have someone else by the name of Dr. Robert Moss. He was the president of the United Church. He made this comment in 1975. Okay, he said, this is a quote, "We should not be deceived by the use of the term Zionism. The sponsors of this resolution mean by it Jews and Judaism as well as the state of Israel." Okay, we're talking about 45 years ago, statements made by individuals who are clearly comparing Judaism and Zionism, and therefore anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. Now, the Muslims hate the Jews, we understand, right? Russians support the Arabs for their own reasons. Now, what's fascinating is how much anti-Semitism is mixed in with so much of the leftists' opposition to Israel. Now, what's even more revealing is this particular article written by Ellen Willis. Is there still a Jewish question? This was written in Tablet Magazine, August 13, 2014. If you want the full article, definitely worth reading. Super, super interesting. Okay, now Willis acknowledges that that from various leftist perspectives, there are real problems with the very idea of a Jewish state, right? And there are very valid criticisms. I have issues with the state of Israel's approach to certain things. I'm not comfortable with it, right? But what she does in this article is she points out that clearly something else, something more distorted is taking place when the leftists are pointing out their issues with Zionism and the Jewish state. So I'm going to read quotes from this article. This article is like delicious. If you want it, just message me here. I'll send you a link to it. So this is a quote. She says, along with the one-sided view of the conflict, the left has focused on Israeli acts of domination and human rights violations with an intense and consistent outrage that it fails to direct towards the comparable or worse abuse elsewhere. Certainly towards the unvarnished tyrannies of the Middle East, where, for instance, is the divestment campaigns against Saudi Arabia. No, I'm not saying it's reasonable to demand that the critics of Israel simultaneously oppose all the violence, misery, and despotism of the world, or that complaints against Israel are invalid because Arab regimes are worse. Inevitably, at any given time, some countries, some conflicts will capture people's imagination and indignation more than others. Not because they are worse, but because they somehow hit a nerve. They become larger than themselves. They take on a symbolic dimension. But that is exactly my point. Left animus, left hostility toward Israel is not simple, self-evident product of the facts. What is the nerve that Israel hits? She's making a point over here. Okay, this Ellen Willis is making a point. There's something different about this particular type of hatred, this type of criticism that you don't find anywhere else. And how do we justify this? How do we explain this? How do we deal with this? So she continues that article. She says, underlying these questions are the hyperbolic comparisons that animate the anti-Israel brief, beginning with the now standard South African comparison that we recall a settler state and apartheid state, which has inspired the calls for divestment and for boycott against Israel and academics. Now, the South African regime, of course, was one whose essence was proudly white racist ideology, a draconian system of legal segregation, and the denial of all political rights to the huge majority of the people. To see Israel through this grid is to ignore a great many things. Israel was settled primarily by refugees from genocide in Europe and oppression in Arab countries. That while Palestinian Israelis suffer from discrimination, they are nevertheless citizens who vote, who organize political parties, and participate in the government. That the occupation, while egregious, came about as a result of aggressive settlement, but of defensive war. That it continues because of rejectionism on both sides. That there is a difference between the nationalists and the ultra-Orthodox militants who dream of a greater Israel, and the majority of Israelis who once supported peace but turned to Sharon out of fear and cynicism. As for Israeli academics, there are independent and disproportionately active in opposing government policy, which leaves the boycott movement with no plausible rationale. How can we explain that BDS makes sense in a world of so much diversity and acceptism, where you have in the Israeli government, you have political Arab parties? Explain that to me. How can we say it's the same? It doesn't make any sense. Even more fantastic is the Nazi comparison, often expressed in metaphors. Israeli soldiers are SS men and so on. Now, she says, I imagine that most perpetrators of this equation, if pressed, would concede that Israel is not a totalitarian dictatorship with a program of world domination, nor has it engaged in the systematic murder of millions of people on the grounds that they are a subhuman race. Israel's not doing that. But why do these tropes have such appeal? Where does it come from? The impulse to go beyond taking Israel to task for its concrete misdeeds. to lump it with the worst, most criminal states in history? That's a great question. Why is this the case? That Israel is seen as a Western graft of the middle of the Arab Middle East, a view Israelis themselves would contest, given that most population comes from the Middle East or North Africa. And a segregate for American power contributes to the symbolic importance of the targets, as does an unconscious condescension towards Arabs that leads double standards of moral expectations for Israel and its neighbors. But it's impossible now to notice how runaway inflation of Israeli villainy aligns with the ingrained cultural fantasies about the iniquity and power of Jews, or how the traditional pariah status of Jews has been replicated by the Jewish pariah state, and the special fury and vitriol that greet any attempt to bring up the subject in left circles further suggest that more is at stake here than an ordinary political dispute, just as more is at stake with the Israeli-Palestinian clash than an ordinary border dispute. Now, Miss Willis is from a very, very different perspective from our own, but she answers her own questions the same way we do. The left's exaggerated hatred for Israel stems from the ancient hatred of the Jews as God's chosen people, period. Right? That's just what she's saying. Right? The idea that I want to be clear. There are people in the world that are anti-Zionists, that are not anti-Semites. But to hear the nuances is very, very difficult. To find people who understand the nature of this conflict, it's not so simple. To call Jews colonizers, bad argument. Jews have been there in the state of Israel for quite some time, living alongside Palestinians. Jews were, not a people that have no claim to the land. They've lived there 2,000 years ago. They were actually colonized by a whole bunch of other people, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, the Brits, and so on and so forth. If anything, the Jews have recolonized their own land. So these are all sensitive tropes. These are sensitive pieces of information in our history, but to understand them requires an academic degree. Not so simple. Now, many on the left, right, view this wave of anti-Semitism as just another expression, right? Now, however unfortunately couched that expression is of justifies rage at Israel, whether it's the occupation, whether it's the escalating, destruction of the West Bank or the state's existence, in either case, the conflation of Zionists and Jews is regarded as a misunderstanding for the politically uneducated, which is to say that Israel is the problem, not only for Palestinians, but for Jews as well. There's a serious failure of imagination. For in fact, Israel's conflict with the Arab world owes more to the peculiar role played by the Jews in history, culture, Judeo-Christian Islamic psyche, and vice versa. This is a quote. Half a century ago, Israel was supposed to have a period of a long, sordid history of Christian European anti-Semitism with a genocidal climax. Instead, it turned out that the Europeans had, in effect, displaced the Jewish problem, which Hitler had failed to solve onto new territory. Jews were never wanted throughout Europe. We were just tolerated in the Arab lands. So when the Nazis killed 6 million of our brothers and sisters, there was no choice. We realized that we were not safe in any country without having our homeland. They created this outpouring of Jews coming back to our homeland after 2,000 years. Jews believed that they could be accepted citizens in the countries that they were in. And somehow the whole thing came tumbling down. Now she continues, she says, the developments expose the core Zionists' belief that an end to Jews' stateless condition would normalize Jewish life as very tragically naive. If Israel's conflict with Palestinians and the Arabs generally cannot be understood without reference to the larger question of relations between Jews and the rest of the world, what of its audience, that is, the international community, including the American left? I'd argue that no one, Jewish or not, brought up in a Christian or Islamic-dominated culture can come to this issue without baggage. Since the patriarchal monotheism that governs our sexually repressive structure of morality and all the ambivalence that goes with it, it was invented by the Jews. The concept of one transcendent God has a double meaning. It proclaims that the subordination of all human authority to the higher reality at the same time that codified as God the Father. It affirms the patriarchal hierarchy. The Jews and their mythic role as the chosen people destined to achieve the redemption of the world through their adherence to God's law embody a similar duality. They are the bearers of spiritual freedom on the one hand, the patriarchal authority and the control of desire on the other. In relation to Christianity and Islam, the Jews are the authors of morality, but also the stubborn naysayers, setting themselves apart, refusing to embrace Jesus or Muhammad at the fulfillment of their quest. So we're screwed. We're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, no matter what we do. Now, recent events show us clearly if the form of anti-Semitism has changed, it is not mere history. Okay, so you have Ron Rosenbaum, who he wrote in Slate magazine in 2014. He says, after a clear description of how Hamas official charter actually calls for the genocide of the Jews, you want to talk about Hitler analogies? Even Hitler never came that specific in Mein Kampf. He never set out to kill every single Jew. Many scholars believe that Hitler gave a wartime extermination order orally, although in 1939 there was a pre-war speech where he pledged himself to the destruction of world Jewry, a speech that was not taken literally by most of the world. Compared to Hamas, Hitler was cautious. He was a political. Now, of course, he wanted to exterminate Jews, but he didn't write them into the constitution of the Third Reich. So there it is for all the world to see. He did not want everyone to see that he was the real hashtag genocide in Gaza, right? Was still a dream, true, but a dream that can never come true. It's not as if it would be an unimaginable task to murder another 5 or 6 million Jews just over the border. The thousands of rockets Hamas fired at Israel since they took Gaza, rockets that tried and mostly failed to kill non-combatants, could easily become far more deadly and sophisticated in time. And we're seeing that's happening right now. Their dreams are coming true, maybe tactical nukes. Who knows what's going to happen next? Now, as a brilliant Holocaust writer, Imre Kurtz wrote, before Auschwitz, this is a quote, before Auschwitz, Auschwitz was unimaginable. That is no longer so today because Auschwitz in fact occurred. It has now been established in our imagination as firmly possible. What are we able to imagine, especially because it once was, can be again? Just because something happened in the past and we said never again doesn't mean it won't happen again. For a quarter of a century, okay, you have a genocidal Hamas, which pledged, right, that they're going to commit genocide on another group of people, and no one says boo towards it. It's not a metaphor. It's a mission statement. It's crazy. I'm saying these words are insane. It's not a metaphor. Their mission statement is to kill the Jews. Now, I find the unwillingness of the world to take this into account, to take it seriously, to understand that the Israeli response to it, the Israeli rage generated by a genocidal threat that dictates what some, including myself at times, may see as disproportionate response, is probably the most telling disconnect between the reality and the reporting of the Gaza conflict. Because believe me, the Israeli people are not ignorant of the Hamas covenant. They are not unaware of its seriousness and the consequences thereof. Oh, the Palestinians, they're so weak. They're so poor. Their missiles don't even work. It's not fair. It's disproportionate. The Jews have the Iron Dome. The Palestinians don't. We don't have a charter to wipe out the Palestinians off the planet. They do. We're going to take it very seriously. We know what happened 75 years ago. We're not blind. We're not dumb. We're actually pretty smart. You want to understand why there's a disproportionate response? Because 6 million of my brothers and sisters were murdered in gas chambers. Where was the world to protect them? There is no one in the world to protect them. We need a state that's going to protect Jews, period. Now, you have some foreign Hamas supporters. They try to play down the covenant, right? They say it's a little concern. True, it's been there for a quarter of a century from the very founding of Hamas, but no Hamas leader has ever renounced it. It's at the heart of if it's of the command of from the prophet with a very day of judgment at stake for the success of the genocidal mission. But one Jewish defender of Hamas, right? He said that the genocide imperative should be regarded as if it was a some kind of a boilerplate rhetoric, and therefore, Hamas was only really concerned with the murdering of 5 million Jews of Israel, not all the Jews in the world, and therefore it's not so bad. Come on, right? I'll say this: I find that thought very, very reassuring that they only want to kill the 5.5 million Jews in Israel, not all around the world. Please, ignoramuses comparing Israel to Nazis and Gaza to genocide while ignoring the actual ongoing genocide in Syria, currently in Iraq. We have to see them as carrying a double standard to which Israelis and Jews are subjected to. Not fair. Period. There are other places in the world that are far worse than whatever's happening in Israel. Just a double standard. Now, I'm sorry, when you're using slogans like hashtag Hitler was right, hashtag genocide in Gaza, right? It's clear to me that those kinds of hashtags are that's Jewish hatred. Period. It's a twisted joy of an excuse for Jewish hatred. A hatred, it seems clear, that was never eradicated from humanity. Maybe it was driven briefly underground, right? But there's these chants, death to the Jews, or from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is not so different than what was happening in Europe. It's clear that there is a system of anti-Semitism that has been raised. In France, you have Jews being beaten and murdered. In England, rabbis attacked walking the streets, people calling, asking whether or not they could wear Jewish symbols outside. Well, why is that happening? Because of what? Because how is the Hasidic man in Williamsburg connected to the Jewish state in Israel? The Hasidic guy in Williamsburg doesn't like the Jewish state. He hates the Jewish state. He's the wrong guy. Why are you coming after him? Oh, because Zionism is Judaism. It's the Jewish thing. Gaza gives European a fraudulent but a very satisfying way of getting out of the complicity of Hitler's genocide. This is a clever way for them to be anti-Semitic without saying, I'm not anti-Semite, I'm just anti-Zionist. Sorry, they're one and the same. Everyone debates the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I think that the hashtag, Hitler was right, or genocide in Gaza shows us exactly what the true intention of these people are, right? Dr. Martin Luther King was once responded to a black student's tirade against Zionism, right? He wrote this. This is written in a book called Midstream. This is written in May 1976, and this is coming from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He says, when people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. Period. You're talking anti-Semitism. Period. So that leaves us with, well, how do we ever criticize Israel? Well, there is a way of criticizing Israel. It's by not having a double standard. You want to go ahead? If we're creating all this outrage, if Israelis are creating a greater outrage for injustice than everyone else in the world, then we know it's anti-Semitism, period. If the same guy comes out and says, you know what? No, we have to boycott, we have to BDS Syria, we have to BDS Iran, that the Ayatollah Khomeini could go ahead and literally call out death to Zionists, death to Israel on Twitter, and still be on Twitter and not be censored or canceled. Hello? You got to be crazy. What's going on? What kind of a world are we living in? Doesn't make any sense. It's insanity. And this is all part of the uniqueness of anti-Semitism. The uniqueness of anti-Semitism is longevity. It's the oldest hatred in history. Ever since the time of Abraham, we can identify the presence of anti-Semitism. It's universal, right? It's been experienced everywhere Jews have lived in history without any exception. It doesn't matter where you came from. And it's permanent. Anti-Semitism remains embedded in the collective cultural consciousness of communities and peoples, Even long after Jews have left and been expelled from their lands, it's still there. Intensity. Anti-Semitism has been expressed as ongoing hatred, persecution, exile, violence, and genocide more than any other hatred in history. Fantasy. Hatred against any minority group usually develops out of a misinterpretation of reality. The case of anti-Semitism is different in that there is no such misinterpretation but sheer fantasy. Jews are rich, they're poor. They control, they don't control. Make up your mind. We're educated, we're uneducated. It's just fantasy. There's nothing there. Irrationality. The famous distinguished professor emeritus of political science at Rutgers University, Michael Curtis, he observed that everything and its opposite is an excuse to hate the Jews. Again, everything and its opposite is an excuse to hate the Jews. This irrationality is unique to anti-Semitism. Everybody has a people they hate, a group they don't like. That's threatening you. But the uniqueness of anti-Semitism lies in the fact that no other people in the world have been charged simultaneously with alienation from society and with cosmopolitanism, with being a capitalist and with being a communist, with being a materialist and so on and so forth. We're accused of being both militant aggressors and coward pacifists. We're called, superstitious religions and agents of modernism and atheism. Right? We uphold rigid law, and we're also morally decadent. We have a chosen people mentality and an inferior human nature. We're both arrogant and timid, individualistic and communal. We're guilty of both the crucifixion of Jesus to the Christians, and to the others, we're held account for the inventing Christianity. He's like, which way does it go? It's insanity. Everything and its opposite becomes an excuse for anti-Semitism. This uniqueness of anti-Semitism compels us to ask if the cause of the phenomenon is unique, right? There are all kinds of theories of anti-Semitism and of how, where it comes from, and so on and so forth. And God willing, next week in our conversation, I'm going to go through different theories for anti-Semitism. So hang in tight. We're in for another ride. I'm probably going to do this for another 3 or 4 weeks. I apologize, but I'm telling you, it's definitely worth it. You will learn a lot. If anyone wants any of my notes, anyone wants to see any of the sources, please let me know. I'm happy to share them. Wishing you all a fantastic day. May we live in a time, in a world where we see the end of anti-Semitism. We see the end of all hatred in the world. And we see a world that finally understands peace, that every single human being ultimately was created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God. We're all brothers, whether we like it or not. Have an amazing day, everybody. Thank you so much for listening.